A young boy found an envelope full of money on the street. What he did with it left everyone in tears. Henry, a 10-year-old boy with a heart far bigger than his years, lived in the modest outskirts of a bustling city. His neighborhood was a maze of cracked sidewalks, peeling paint, and weary faces, but was home. For as long as he could remember, life had been a delicate balancing act for him and his mother, Caroline. Caroline worked double shifts at a diner downtown, often returning long after Henry had fallen asleep. Her hands were calloused, her smile worn thin, but her love for Henry never faltered. She often reminded him, "We may not have much, but we have each other, and that's what counts." Yet, as bills piled up and groceries ran low, even Henry, with his innocent optimism, couldn't help but notice the weight on her shoulders. Every morning before school, Henry would slip out early to collect cans and bottles from the streets. The few dollars he earned from recycling were his small contribution to the family's struggle. Though Caroline never asked for his help, Henry was determined to ease her burden in any way he could. Despite their hardships, Henry had a warm, curious nature. He would often daydream about a different life, one where his mother didn't have to work so hard, and where he could buy her the little luxuries she deserved. But daydreams didn't fill empty plates. One brisk autumn morning, Henry found himself wandering through the city's crowded streets, his backpack heavy with cans. The air was crisp, and fallen leaves danced around his feet. Though the day seemed ordinary, Henry couldn't shake a feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. Little did he know, destiny was about to intervene in a way that would change his life forever. Henry's path home from school always meandered through the busiest part of the city, where traffic hummed and strangers brushed past in hurried waves. He enjoyed the chaos. It made him feel small but alive. That day, as the crisp autumn air nipped at his cheeks, his eyes darted around in their usual curious rhythm. He stopped at a corner where the old hardware store stood, its windows clouded with grime and its wooden sign creaking in the wind. As he bent down to adjust the strap of his worn backpack, something unusual caught his eye. There, half tucked under the curb near a pile of fallen leaves, was an envelope. It was beige, ordinary at first glance, but there was a weight to it, literally. Intrigued, Henry picked it up, brushing off the dirt that clung to its surface. His small fingers felt a thickness inside, and a corner of green peeked through the slightly unsealed flap. His heart skipped a beat as he realized what it was. Money. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope fully, revealing a stack of crisp bills. There were tens, 20s, and even a few hundreds, more money than he had ever seen in his life. It had to be at least a few $1,000s. His breath quickened, and for a moment he stood frozen, the envelope clutched tightly in his hands. His first thought was of his mother. What this money could do for her. Groceries for months, bills paid off, maybe even a chance to rest instead of working endless double shifts. The temptation gnawed at him like a growing flame. But almost immediately, another thought pushed its way to the surface. Someone had lost this. Someone might need it even more than they did. What if it belonged to a person like his mother, desperately trying to make ends meet? Henry looked around, searching for a clue to who might have dropped it. The street was busy as ever, but no one seemed to notice him standing there, holding the envelope as if it contained the weight of the world. With a deep breath, he made a decision. He couldn't just keep it. He had to try to find the owner. The thought filled him with a strange mix of fear and resolve. Little did he know, his choice would lead him down a path he never could have imagined. Henry couldn't shake the weight of the envelope in his hands. As he stood on a crowded sidewalk, the noise of the city faded into the background. His heart pounded with every step as he began his search, scanning the faces of the bustling crowd. Surely, whoever had lost this money would be frantic to find it. He decided to start small. Approaching the nearest shop, a small bakery with warm smells wafting into the street, Henry stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, and a kind-faced woman behind the counter greeted him. "Can I help you, sweetheart?" she asked. "Hi. Did anyone come in here looking for an envelope? Like a lost one?" Henry hesitated, unsure how much he should reveal. The woman frowned thoughtfully. "No, haven't heard anything like that. Did you lose something, honey?" Henry shook his head quickly. "Never mind. Thanks." He turned to leave, clutching the envelope tightly in his pocket. Over the next few hours, Henry tried his luck at different stores, asking cautious questions to avoid drawing too much attention. Each time, he received the same answer. No one had reported anything missing. Frustration began to creep in, but he wasn't ready to give up. As the afternoon turned into evening, Henry's stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since lunch. He found a bench near a park and sat down, staring at the envelope as the setting sun painted the sky orange and pink. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe no one was looking for it. But then he noticed something he hadn't before, a small, faint scribble on the outside of the envelope. Leaning closer, he squinted at the faint handwriting. It read, "Mr. Howard, medical expenses." Henry's chest tightened. Medical expenses? Whoever this money belonged to might need it desperately. A flood of urgency rushed through him. He needed to find Mr. Howard. With a renewed sense of purpose, Henry got up and began asking around again, this time with a name. After several dead ends, an elderly woman sitting on a stoop outside her home paused when she heard the name. "Howard," she repeated, adjusting her glasses. "You mean old Mr. Clark Howard? Lives a couple blocks over, near the hardware store." Henry's heart leaped. He thanked her quickly and set off, his legs moving faster with every step. Little did he know, the person he was about to meet would not only change his life but reveal a truth he never could have imagined. The house stood in quiet solitude at the end of the block, its chipped paint and dim porch lights speaking of years gone by. Henry felt a lump in his throat as he approached, the envelope clutched tightly in his hands. His mind swirled with questions. What kind of person was Mr. Howard? Would he even believe a boy like Henry had brought the money back? He knocked softly on the door. It took a moment, but soon there was the sound of shuffling footsteps. The door opened, and an elderly man appeared. He had a frail frame, his hands gripping a cane for support, and his silver hair glinted faintly in the porch light. His face, though lined with age, carried a quiet strength. "Yes," the man asked, his voice low and weathered. Henry hesitated, suddenly unsure how to begin. "Are you Mr. Howard?" "That's me," the man replied, narrowing his eyes slightly. "Who's asking?" "I think this might be yours." Henry reached into his pocket and carefully pulled out the envelope. "I found it near the hardware store. It says Mr. Howard on it." The old man's eyes widened as he took the envelope with trembling hands. He opened it slowly, his expression shifting from shock to deep relief as he saw the stack of bills inside. "My God," he whispered, his voice breaking. You found it. I thought it was gone forever." Henry shuffled nervously. "I just wanted to make sure it got back to you." Mr. Howard stared at the boy, his hands still clutching the envelope as if it might disappear. "You don't know what you've done, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This money, it's for my surgery. I've been saving for so long. I didn't think I'd ever see it again." Henry's chest tightened at the man's words, a strange mix of pride and sadness filling him. "I'm glad I found it," he said softly. For a moment, there was only silence between them. Then, Mr. Howard's gaze lingered on Henry, his brow furrowing slightly as if he were studying the boy. "What did you say your name was, son?" "Henry," he replied, glancing down at his feet. "Henry," the old man repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, faint but undeniable. That's a name I haven't heard in a long time." Henry tilted his head, confused. "What do you mean?" Mr. Howard seemed lost in thought, his expression growing distant. "You remind me of someone," he said slowly. "Someone I knew a long time ago." Henry blinked, unsure how to respond. Before he could say anything, Mr. Howard's voice broke the silence again, softer this time. "Does your mother happen to be named Caroline?" The question froze Henry in place. "How do you know my mom?" he asked, his voice tinged with both surprise and suspicion. Mr. Howard's eyes glistened as he seemed to age another decade in front of Henry. "Because she's my daughter," he said, the words heavy with emotion. Henry's breath caught in his chest. His mind, reeling as the world around him, seemed to tilt. Henry stared at Mr. Howard, the words echoing in his mind. "She's my daughter." It felt impossible, like the kind of twist that only happened in books or movies. And yet, standing there on the man's creaky porch, Henry could feel the truth hanging in the air between them. "My mom your daughter?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Howard nodded, his face etched with emotion. "I haven't seen Caroline in years. Not since a long time ago." He lowered his gaze, gripping the doorframe for balance. "And not a day has gone by that I haven't thought of her." Henry's confusion was slowly giving way to something deeper, curiosity, even anger. Why haven't you? Why did you stop seeing her? He blurted, the question slipping out before he could stop it. The old man sighed, the weight of his years suddenly visible in the slump of his shoulders. It's a long story, son. One I've regretted every single day of my life. He gestured toward the small living room behind him. Why don't you come in? I think there's a lot we need to talk about. Henry hesitated for a moment, but something in Mr. Howard's voice, the sincerity, the pain, made him nod. He stepped inside, taking in the sparse but cozy room. It smelled faintly of old wood and dust, and the furniture was worn but well kept. A single picture frame sat on the mantel above the fireplace. Sit down, Mr. Howard said, easing himself into a faded armchair. Henry took a seat across from him on a sagging couch. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Mr. Howard broke the silence. Your mother and we had a falling out when she was younger. I made mistakes, big ones. I said things I shouldn't have, things that hurt her. His voice wavered as he continued, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. She wanted to go her own way, and I let my pride get in the way of being a father. Henry frowned, trying to reconcile this man's words with a mother he knew, the strong, loving woman who had always been his rock. She never talks about you, he said quietly. Mr. Howard winced but nodded. I don't blame her. I wasn't there when she needed me most, but I never stopped loving her, or hoping that, one day, I might get the chance to make things right. Henry didn't know what to say. He had come here to return an envelope, but now he was face to face with a man who claimed to be part of his family, a man whose story felt tangled and sad. Finally, Mr. Howard spoke again, his voice softer this time. You showing up here, it feels like fate, Henry. Like maybe I'm getting a second chance. He leaned forward, his eyes glistening. But only if you and your mom will let me. Henry didn't answer right away. There was too much to process, too many emotions swirling inside him. But one thing was certain, this meeting was only the beginning. The walk home felt like a blur. Henry's thoughts spun in a whirlwind of questions and emotions. He clutched his backpack tightly, the cool evening air biting at his cheeks. Could Mr. Howard really be his grandfather? And if he was, why had his mom never mentioned him? When Henry finally reached their small apartment, the comforting smell of Caroline's cooking wafted through the door. She stood at the stove, her back to him, stirring a pot of something that bubbled softly. Hey, kiddo, she said without turning around. Dinner's almost ready. How was school? Henry hesitated, standing frozen in the doorway. How was he supposed to bring this up? The envelope, Mr. Howard, the truth he had learned. It all felt too big, too heavy. Henry. Caroline turned to face him, her brow furrowing when she saw the expression on his face. What's wrong? Did something happen? He took a deep breath and set his backpack down. Mom, I need to tell you something. And it's kind of, Her eyes softened with concern as she wiped her hands on a dish towel and moved closer. Okay. What is it? Henry fumbled for the right words, his heart pounding. I found something today. An envelope. It had a lot of money in it, and I thought about keeping it, but then I decided to find the owner. And I did. Caroline blinked, surprised. Henry, that's incredible. I'm proud of you. But what does this have to do with? It belonged to a man named Clark Howard, Henry interrupted, his voice trembling. And he said he's your dad. The words landed like a thunderclap. Caroline's expression shifted instantly. Her face went pale, her lips parted in shock. For a moment, she didn't speak. My dad, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Henry nodded, unsure what to say next. He told me he hasn't seen you in years. He said he made mistakes, and he wants to make things right. Caroline turned away, gripping the edge of the counter. Her shoulders stiffened, and when she spoke again, her voice was tight. You talked to him? Yes, Henry admitted. I didn't know who he was at first, but I thought you should know. Silence filled the room, heavy and unyielding. Finally, Caroline let out a shaky breath. Henry, there's so much you don't know. Things I've never told you, because I didn't want to hurt you. Henry stepped closer, his chest tightening. Mom, I think he really wants to see you. He seemed sad, like he's been waiting for this chance. Caroline shook her head, but her resolve seemed to falter. I don't know, Henry. I don't know if I can face him after all these years. Henry reached for her hand, his small fingers curling around hers. Maybe this is our chance, too. To have something we didn't before. Caroline looked down at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She didn't answer right away, but deep down, Henry could feel the walls she had built beginning to crack. The next morning, the apartment was unusually quiet. Caroline sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Henry watched her from the living room, unsure if he should say something or wait. He knew his mom was grappling with the weight of the decision ahead, whether to see the man she hadn't spoken to in decades. Finally, she looked up, her expression a mix of determination and fear. "Henry," she called softly. He stepped into the kitchen. "Yeah, I'll do it," she said, her voice steady but low. "I'll go see him. But I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for you. If he's part of your life now, I owe it to you to hear him out." Henry nodded, relief and nervousness mingling in his chest. "Do you want me to come with you?" Caroline hesitated, then gave him a small smile. "I think I need to do this alone. At least at first." Later that afternoon, Henry watched as his mom left the apartment, her posture stiff with apprehension. He wanted to follow her, to be there in case things went wrong, but he knew she needed this moment for herself. Caroline arrived at the small house Henry had described, her heart pounding so loudly she could hardly think. She stood at the door for what felt like an eternity, her hand hovering over the doorbell. Finally, she pressed it, the soft chime echoing inside. It didn't take long for the door to open. Clark Howard appeared, leaning on his cane, his expression one of cautious hope. When his eyes landed on Caroline, he froze. "Caroline," he whispered, his voice breaking. She swallowed hard, a storm of emotions rising within her, anger, sadness, and something she hadn't expected, longing. "Hello, Dad," she said, her tone measured but fragile. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Clark stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "Come in." Caroline entered the house, her gaze sweeping over the modest living room. It hadn't changed much from what she remembered as a child, though it felt smaller now. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again," Clark said, easing himself into his armchair. But when Henry showed up yesterday, his voice trailed off as he looked at her, his eyes filled with remorse. "I knew I couldn't let this chance slip away." Caroline sat down across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's been a long time, Dad. A lot has happened." "I know," he said softly, "and I know I'm the reason for most of it. I failed you, Caroline. I'll let my pride and my stubbornness drive you away. I can't take back what I did, but if you'll let me, I want to make it right." Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "You hurt me," she said, her voice trembling. "When I needed you most, you turned your back on me. Do you even know what that did to me? To my life?" Clark's head bowed, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. "And I've lived with that guilt every day since. You don't have to forgive me, Caroline. But I need you to know that I've never stopped loving you." The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken pain and unacknowledged love. Caroline stared at her father, the years of distance and resentment warring with the faint ember of connection she still felt. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you," she admitted finally. "But I'm here. That has to count for something." Clark nodded, his eyes glistening. "It does," he said softly. "It counts for everything." Days later, they had spent time together at Clark's house. The evening had been one of cautious joy. Clark sat at the head of the table, his frail hands shaking slightly as he carved the roast chicken he had insisted on preparing. Caroline and Henry exchanged amused glances, offering to help, but Clark waved them off. "I may be old, but I'm not helpless," he chuckled, his voice light. It was the kind of laughter that hadn't been heard in their family for years, and for a while, the air felt almost normal. Henry listened intently as Clark shared stories from his youth, tales of pranks pulled on friends, adventures on fishing trips, and the time he had accidentally set a barn on fire as a boy. Even Caroline couldn't help but smile at some of the memories, though she remained more reserved, still feeling the weight of their long estrangement. "You know, Dad," Caroline said at one point, setting her fork down, "for all the trouble you've caused, you do tell a good story." Clark grinned, a hint of his younger self shining through. "Well, I've had plenty of time to polish them," he replied, his tone warm. As the evening stretched on, Henry found himself imagining more nights like this. Family dinners, laughter, and maybe even holidays spent together. For the first time, the idea of a whole family didn't seem so impossible. But just as the thought took root, something shifted. Clark's laughter faltered mid-sentence, and he brought a hand to his chest, his face paling. "Dad," Caroline asked, her smile fading. Clark tried to wave her off. "Just a little dizzy," he muttered, but his words slurred slightly, and his hand trembled as he reached for the table. Henry's chair scraped against the floor as he shot to his feet. "Grandpa." "I'm fine," Clark insisted weakly, but his body betrayed him. His cane slipped from his grasp, and he slumped forward, his breathing shallow. "Dad," Caroline cried, rushing to his side. The panic in her voice sent Henry running for the phone. His hands shook as he dialed 911, his heart pounding in his chest. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived, and the once-warm dining room was filled with flashing lights and hurried voices. Caroline held Clark's hand tightly as the paramedics worked around him, her face pale but determined. "Hang on, Dad," she whispered. "We're not losing you now." Henry followed close behind as they carried Clark out, the pocket watch he had given him earlier that evening clenched tightly in his hand. The ride to the hospital was a blur, filled with silent prayers and stolen glances at Clark, who lay motionless but still breathing. When they arrived, the doctors acted quickly. Clark was rushed into surgery, the urgency in their voices a stark contrast to the laughter that had filled the house just hours ago. Sitting in a sterile hospital waiting room, Caroline and Henry clung to each other. The thought of losing Clark now, just as they had begun to mend the fractures in their family, was too much to bear. "He's strong, Mom," Henry said, his voice trembling. "He'll pull through." "He has to." Caroline nodded, though her tears fell freely. "I hope you're right," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the double doors that separated them from Clark. As the hours dragged on, they could do nothing but wait, their hearts heavy with fear and fragile hope. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting faint golden streaks on the walls. Clark lay in a hospital bed, his face pale but peaceful. His chest rose and fell steadily, his breathing stronger than it had been the night before. Caroline sat by his side, her hand resting on his, the relief evident in her tired eyes. Henry sat in the corner of the room, the pocket watch still clutched in his hand, as if holding on to it could somehow protect his grandfather. When Clark's eyes finally fluttered open, Caroline leaned forward, her breath catching. "Dad." He blinked a few times before his gaze settled on her. A faint, tired smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Hey, kid," he murmured, his voice hoarse but steady. Caroline let out a soft laugh, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You scared us," she said, her voice cracking. Clark chuckled weakly. "Didn't mean to," he replied, shifting slightly in the bed. His gaze shifted to Henry, who had moved closer. "Hey, sport." Henry smiled, his eyes wet but bright. "Hi, Grandpa. You're okay." Clark nodded slowly. "Looks like I am. Guess I've got more fight in me than I thought." The doctor came in a short while later, explaining that the surgery had been a success. With rest and care, Clark was expected to make a full recovery. The news felt like a weight lifted off their shoulders, and for the first time in days, Caroline and Henry allowed themselves to breathe easily. Over the weeks that followed, Clark grew stronger. Caroline and Henry visited him every day, bringing him home-cooked meals, stories from their day, and even a few jokes to lift his spirits. Slowly but surely, the bonds between them grew stronger. One sunny afternoon, Clark was discharged from the hospital, stepping out into the crisp autumn air with Caroline on one side and Henry on the other. As they walked together, Henry looked up at his grandfather. "Grandpa, can we have dinner at your house again? Like before?" Clark grinned, his cane tapping lightly against the sidewalk. "You bet we can. But this time, your mom's doing the cooking." Caroline rolled her eyes, but a smile spread across her face. "Fine, but don't complain if I overcook the chicken." They all laughed, the sound echoing through the quiet street. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done, but they were together, and that was what mattered most. Later that evening, as they sat around Clark's dining table once again, Henry couldn't help but glance at the envelope that now rested on the mantel, framed and displayed like a trophy. "Grandpa," he said, his voice soft, "do you think it was fate? Me finding that envelope and bringing it to you?" Clark paused, his expression thoughtful as he looked at his grandson. "I don't know about fate," he said, his voice warm. "But I do know that what you did, choosing to do the right thing, that's what brought us here. That's what made this happen." Henry smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride. As the sun set outside, bathing the room in a soft orange glow, the three of them sat together, sharing stories, laughter, and hope for the future. The past was still there, but it no longer defined them. Together, they were building something new, a family bound not just by blood, but by the choices that had brought them back to each other. And for Henry, it was a reminder that sometimes even the smallest decisions could change everything. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Join us for more inspiring, heartwarming, and unforgettable stories that remind us of the power of kindness, family, and second chances. Turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of our next incredible tale. See you in the next one.